The courthouse steps baked under the late March sun heat, shimmering off concrete that hadn't seen rain in weeks. Vivian Hartwell stood with her son's hand gripped in hers, watching men in pressed suits cluster around the auctioneer's podium. Her fingers traced the edge of the envelope in her pocket. $73.18. Everything left after the foreclosure, the divorce settlement that barely covered 2 months of groceries, the endless stream of bills that had swallowed her teaching salary whole. Nathaniel shifted beside her, 12 years old, but carrying himself with the careful stillness of someone much older. The past year had aged him, watching their furniture disappear into a moving truck, sleeping in the back of their Honda for 3 nights before the motel took pity, learning that home was not a permanent thing but something that could be taken away by signatures on paper. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the lawn, announcing properties with the practiced rhythm of a carnival barker. A 3-bedroom ranch went for $48,000. A commercial lot near the highway climbed to $90,000. Each time the gavel fell, Vivian felt the weight of her own inadequacy pressing harder against her chest. She should leave. This was foolishness, standing here with pocket change while real buyers conducted real business. But the motel had already asked when they'd be checking out, and her last paycheck wouldn't arrive for another week. The Honda's check engine light had been glowing for 6 days. The auctioneer shuffled papers, his enthusiasm dimming. Item 14. Mountain cabin on Blackwell Ridge, 5 acres, no utility structure in severe disrepair. Silence rippled through the crowd. Even the casual browsers looked away, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the distant tree line. Opening bid, $500. No hands rose. The auctioneer's face reddened slightly. 400. 300. 200. A man in an expensive charcoal suit turned to his companion, stage whispering just loud enough for Vivian to hear. Hasn't been touched since old Thornton vanished. Place is probably crawling with raccoons and black mold. $100. The auctioneer's voice had taken on a pleading edge. Surely someone wants a mountain property. 5 acres of timber alone is worth $50. Vivian's mouth opened before her brain caught up. The sound came from somewhere deep in her chest where desperation and defiance had been building for months. 50 cents. Laughter exploded across the lawn. The man in the charcoal suit actually doubled over, slapping his companion's shoulder. The auctioneer squinted toward her, trying to determine if this was mockery or madness. 50 cents, ma'am. This is a legal auction, not a yard sale. Vivian straightened her shoulders, feeling Nate's hand tighten around hers. I have 50 cents. You have no other bidders. The county wants this off the tax rolls. I'm offering what I can. More laughter, but something had shifted in the auctioneer's expression. He conferred with a county official, their heads bent together. Vivian held her breath, aware that she'd just proposed something either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. The official shrugged. Sold. To the lady for 50 cents. See the clerk inside for paperwork. The charcoal suit man approached as Vivian fumbled in her purse for 2 quarters. His smile was all teeth, no warmth. You realize you just bought a worthless pile of rotting timber. Right? That place hasn't been habitable since Thornton disappeared back in the 70s. He shook his head, already turning away. Good luck with your miracle. Inside the courthouse, the clerk processed the deed with raised eyebrows but no questions. Vivian pressed the 2 quarters into her palm, then placed them carefully on the counter. The clerk swept them into a drawer, stamped the paperwork, and slid it across. Congratulations. You're now the proud owner of 5 acres on Blackwell Ridge. Nate waited until they were back in the Honda before speaking, his voice carefully neutral. Are we really going to live in a cabin in the mountains? Vivian folded the deed into her jacket, feeling the cheap paper crinkle. We're going to try. The drive to Blackwell Ridge consumed 2 hours, the last 40 minutes on a rutted dirt road that made the Honda's suspension groan. Civilization fell away in stages. First the suburbs with their identical mailboxes and manicured lawns, then scattered farmhouses connected by gravel driveways. Finally, just forest dense and ancient pressing close on both sides. The GPS signal died 20 minutes from the main highway. Vivian relied on the hand-drawn map the clerk had sketched on the back of their deed, a series of landmarks connected by squiggly lines that may or may not represent actual roads. Turn left at the lightning-struck pine, the notation read. Vivian spotted the blackened tree and steered onto an even narrower track barely wide enough for the Honda. Branches scraped the windows. The undercarriage hit rocks with alarming frequency. Nate pressed his face against the glass, his earlier neutrality giving way to something like wonder. It's like driving off the edge of the world. The track curved around a massive boulder, and suddenly their new home appeared through the trees. Vivian's stomach dropped. Cabin was generous. The structure before them looked one strong wind away from collapse. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, black with rot. Windows were boarded with mismatched planks, some hanging at drunken angles. The porch listed to one side, steps half buried in decades of leaf mulch. Nate's voice came out small. Mom Vivian forced brightness into her tone. "It's a fixer-upper. We knew that." She parked and they climbed out, approaching cautiously. The silence was total. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, nothing but wind moving through pine branches. Vivian had never experienced quiet this complete. It felt like stepping back in time. The padlock on the door was orange with rust but solid. The key from the county clerk, an old iron thing that looked medieval, fit surprisingly well. The lock opened with a reluctant screech. The smell hit first. 55 years of abandonment concentrated into stale air thick enough to taste. Vivian pushed the door wider, letting afternoon sunlight spill across warped floorboards. The main room served as both living area and kitchen. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth built from river rocks fitted together with impressive craftsmanship. Handmade furniture, a table, 2 chairs, built-in shelves, showed signs of someone who'd understood wood and taken pride in their work. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom. A ladder suggested a loft space above. Nate sneezed, disturbing decades of dust that danced in the light beams. No electricity, no running water. How are we supposed to live here? Vivian tested the floorboards, relieved when they held firm despite the creaking. People lived without modern conveniences for thousands of years. We'll adapt. She moved to the boarded windows, working her fingers under the edge of one plank. The wood gave way easily, rotted through. Sunlight flooded the room, revealing details hidden in the gloom. The stone fireplace was truly beautiful, each rock carefully selected and placed. The built-in shelves held a few abandoned items, a coffee can full of rusty nails, a water-stained notebook, some geological survey maps rolled and tied with string. The bedroom was smaller but had its own window facing east. Like the front room, it showed signs of careful construction and long neglect. Built-in shelves lined one wall. A metal bed frame sat empty, springs rusted but intact. Nate ran his hand along the windowsill, tracing something carved into the wood. JT 1967. Vivian leaned closer, examining the careful letters. Someone had taken time to mark this place to claim it as their own. The previous owner, maybe. The clerk mentioned someone named Thornton. They spent the remaining daylight hours taking inventory. The property included roughly 5 acres of wooded land sloping down toward the sound of running water. A creek maybe 200 yards behind the cabin. An outhouse stood at a discreet distance, its structure questionable but potentially salvageable. The forest pressed close on 3 sides, mostly pine and oak, creating natural boundaries. Inside, they swept decades of dust from the floors, uncovering solid hardwood beneath. They removed the remaining boards from windows, allowing cross-ventilation to clear the musty air. The furnishings were sparse but serviceable. Most importantly, the roof had leaked in several places, but the basic structure remained sound. Someone had built this cabin to last. As sunset approached, they unrolled sleeping bags on the freshly swept floor. Their car contained everything they still owned after the foreclosure: clothes, a camp stove, basic tools, the few personal items that had survived their financial collapse. Nate pulled the water-stained notebook from the shelf, flipping through pages that crackled with age. Most of it's ruined. Water damage. But look at this. He held up a page where ink had survived, barely legible but intact. A single line in careful handwriting. The treasure isn't beneath the ground but within it. Vivian took the notebook, turning it to catch the last light. The writing was precise, almost architectural, the kind of hand that measured and calculated, that planned before acting. Could be a riddle, or just someone's philosophical musings, or a clue. Nate's eyes held the kind of hope she hadn't seen in months. Maybe this place isn't as worthless as that guy said. Vivian tucked the notebook into her bag, filing away the mystery for later consideration. Their immediate concerns were far more practical than riddles. That night, lying in her sleeping bag as darkness enveloped the cabin, Vivian listened to unfamiliar sounds. In the city there had been constant background noise, traffic, neighbors' air conditioning, the electronic hum of modern life. Here silence occasionally broke for an owl's call, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant gurgle of the creek. Different, but not worse. Beside her, Nate's breathing had settled into sleep's rhythm. Despite everything, the divorce, the foreclosure, the desperate 50-cent gamble, her son seemed at peace. That counted for something. Vivian pulled out her worn leather journal, a birthday gift from Nate, before everything fell apart. Its pages now contained careful lists and calculations, tracking every expense, mapping their uncertain future. By lantern light, she began a new entry. Day 1 at Blackwell Ridge. Cabin worse than expected but structurally sound. Roof needs immediate repair, 3 leaks identified. Creek approximately 200 yards south, water appears clean but requires testing. Outhouse structurally questionable but workable. No sign of wildlife intrusion. Found initials JT 1967 carved in bedroom windowsill. Mysterious note about treasure within the ground. Tomorrow explore property, fully locate water source, assess outhouse inventory, salvageable materials. Priority roof repair before next rain. She closed the journal, extinguished the lantern, and lay back in the darkness. For the first time since the divorce, they had something that was truly theirs. Not borrowed, not rented, not held at the mercy of someone else's decisions. That had to count for something. Morning light filtered through uncovered windows, geometric patterns sliding across the wooden floor. Vivian woke with the sun, a habit formed during the months when every hour mattered in the scramble to rebuild their lives. Nate still slept curled in his sleeping bag, dark hair falling across his forehead. She allowed him this peace. Outside, mountain air carried a sharpness that cleared her head. Standing on the porch, more stable than it appeared, Vivian surveyed their property. Forest pressed close on 3 sides, mostly pine and oak with undergrowth creating natural boundaries. To the east, the land opened slightly, offering views across the valley to distant ridges layered in blue haze. She followed the sound of water pushing through undergrowth until the creek appeared. 8 feet wide, running over smooth stones with occasional deeper pools. Vivian knelt beside one such pool, dipping her hand into water so cold it made her fingers ache. Her chemistry knowledge would be useful here, testing for contaminants, understanding purification processes, recognizing potential hazards. Returning to the cabin, she found Nate awake and examining the stone fireplace with curious hands. The hearth was solid, built from river rocks fitted together without mortar. The chimney appeared intact, though Vivian made a mental note to check for cracks or blockages before risking a fire. Together they explored more thoroughly in the revealing morning light. The main room's dimensions became clearer, roughly 20 feet square, with the kitchen area defined by a wood stove and a dry sink along the north wall. The back bedroom was half that size, with its built-in shelves and the window bearing those carved initials. The latter led to a loft space just large enough for storage or perhaps a sleeping area once they confirmed its structural integrity. As they moved a heavy cabinet to better access one of the windows, something fluttered to the floor. A yellowed sheet of paper, folded and brittle with age. Nate picked it up carefully, unfolding it to reveal a single line in faded handwriting, the same precise script from the water-stained notebook. The treasure isn't beneath the ground, but within it. The same message written twice. Not random philosophical musing, then. Someone had wanted this phrase found, had placed it carefully where future occupants might discover it. Vivian studied the handwriting, the careful formation of each letter. Could be about mining. These mountains have a history of silver extraction. She tucked the paper into her journal, adding it to the growing collection of mysteries. But practical concerns demanded attention. They spent the morning retrieving belongings from the Honda and setting up the camp stove on the porch for a simple breakfast. Vivian had packed their remaining food with care: oatmeal, dried fruit, canned beans, rice pasta, powdered milk. Enough for 2 weeks if they were careful. By then, she needed a plan for replenishment. After eating, they tackled the most urgent task: assessing roof damage. Without a ladder tall enough, Vivian cautiously climbed onto the Honda's hood, then used the porch roof as a step to reach the main roof. The wooden shingles were worse than feared. Many had rotted completely through. Others hung loose, ready to fail with the next heavy rain. Nate stood below, handing up tools as Vivian examined the damage. "Mom, will this really work?" "Living here?" Vivian paused, considering her answer carefully. "It's going to be hard work, but yes, it can work. People have lived in places like this for centuries. We're just rediscovering old skills." From the roof, she could see farther across their property and the surrounding wilderness. No other cabins were visible, though smoke from a distant chimney suggested they weren't completely alone. The isolation was both blessing and burden. No prying eyes, but also no immediate help in emergencies. By mid-afternoon, they'd removed the worst damaged shingles, leaving several holes that needed covering before nightfall. A tarp from the car, secured with rocks and rope, provided temporary protection. Tomorrow they'd need to find materials for proper repairs, which meant a trip to the nearest town. As Vivian worked, her mind cataloged each problem with the systematic approach of a scientist. The roof required new shingles. Windows needed reglazing or at least plastic coverings for winter. The chimney should be professionally inspected, though they couldn't afford that luxury. The outhouse needed structural reinforcement. Water required testing and a system for regular collection. Food would mean learning to garden, perhaps forage. Each challenge seemed insurmountable alone, yet together they formed a project not just survival, but transformation. The cabin wasn't merely shelter, it was a second chance disguised as desperation. While searching the kitchen area for anything useful, Nate discovered a drawer containing old publications, mining journals from the 1960s, geological surveys of the region, a handwritten notebook with observations about promising mineral deposits in various ridge outcroppings. The previous owner had clearly been interested in more than simple mountain living. These might be valuable. Nate leafed through a journal with diagrams of ore samples. Maybe we could sell them. Vivian examined one publication noting detailed maps of local geological formations, more likely valuable for the information they contain. Knowing what's under these mountains could be useful. She added the materials to her growing collection of items requiring further investigation. The cabin was slowly revealing its secrets, hinting at a previous occupant whose interests extended beyond mere survival. As sunset approached, they cleared enough space to create a comfortable living area. Their sleeping bags remained on the floor, but Vivian had unpacked their few books, arranged cooking supplies near the wood stove, and set up the battery-powered lantern on the handmade table. These small touches of familiarity transformed the abandoned cabin into something approaching home. Vivian heated water on the camp stove for instant soup, their first hot meal in their new dwelling. As they ate cross-legged on sleeping bags, Nate's gaze lingered on the carved initials visible through the bedroom doorway. JT, 1967. Do you think that's who left all the mining stuff? What happened to them? Vivian considered the question. The county clerk hadn't offered much beyond the property's tax delinquent status. Just another mystery to solve. We'll find out more when we go into town tomorrow. She opened her journal, noting their progress and planning tomorrow's tasks with methodical precision. Roof temporarily patched. Windows cleared. Found geological publications suggesting mining history. Creek water collected for testing. Tomorrow drive to Pineville, roofing materials, basic groceries information about previous owner. Ask about water testing chemicals. That night, exhaustion from physical labor brought deep sleep. Vivian dreamed of mountains with veins of silver running through stone, of water flowing clear over precious metals, of treasures hidden in plain sight. The cryptic message echoed through her unconscious mind. The treasure isn't beneath the ground, but within it. The trip to Pineville the next morning proved both enlightening and frustrating. The nearest settlement was 22 miles away, a small mountain community clinging to the highway like a barnacle to a ship's hull. The hardware store occupied a weathered building that had probably stood since the 1950s. The owner, a weathered man in his 60s, raised his eyebrows when Vivian mentioned Blackwell Ridge. "You're living in old Thornton's place. That cabin's been empty since the early 70s. Most folks figured it would collapse eventually." Vivian purchased roofing materials and basic supplies, stretching their limited funds as far as possible. The total came to $48, leaving her with $25 until her next paycheck arrived, assuming the school district processed it correctly. "Do you know anything about Thornton?" The initials JT are carved in one of the windowsills, dated 1967. The store owner, his name tag read. Henry Foster leaned against the counter, his expression contemplative. James Thornton, geologist or mining engineer, something like that, showed up here in the mid-60s, kept mostly to himself. Smart fellow by all accounts, but odd. Spent all his time in the mountains mapping and taking samples. Then one day, March of '71, he just wasn't around anymore. Some say he struck it rich and moved away. Others think the mining companies came after him. Most likely story is he died up there alone and the wilderness took him. Vivian felt something cold settle in her stomach. Mining companies came after him. Why? Henry shrugged. Rumor was he found something valuable. Silver most likely. But he refused to share his surveys with Western Mining, the big company operating around here back then. They didn't like that. Got him fired from the university, destroyed his reputation. Then he disappeared. The librarian offered more concrete information when Vivian inquired later that afternoon. The local history section contained several references to James Thornton, including a newspaper article from 1965 announcing his purchase of the Blackwell Ridge property, described as previously owned by the defunct Blackwell Mining Company. A photograph accompanied the article, a lean, serious man with intelligent eyes and premature gray at his temples. The caption identified him as James Thornton, formerly of Denver, Colorado, now residing in Pineville. Vivian made photocopies of the relevant articles, adding them to her growing collection. Another article from March 1971 bore the headline, "Local Geologist Reported Missing." The text was brief. James Thornton had failed to appear for scheduled meetings. Friends grew concerned. Police investigated. No body was found. The case remained open, but inactive. The mystery of James Thornton provided a welcome distraction from their immediate challenges, a puzzle to solve between the endless tasks of making their shelter habitable. The following weeks fell into a pattern of hard physical labor and incremental improvements. Vivian and Nate replaced damaged roof shingles, sealed windows with plastic sheeting, cleared brush from around the cabin, and established a reliable system for collecting and purifying creek water. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. Vivian began homeschooling Nate using their surroundings as a living classroom. Botany lessons involved identifying edible plants in the forest. Physics came alive through the mechanical advantages of levers and pulleys used in their repair work. Chemistry found practical application in water purification and understanding material properties. Nate thrived under this unconventional education, his natural curiosity engaged by hands-on learning. He developed surprising aptitude with tools, his smaller hands reaching places Vivian couldn't access. Together they became a team, their shared purpose healing some wounds left by their previous life's collapse. The cabin gradually transformed under their care. The roof no longer leaked, windows admitted light while keeping out drafts. The fireplace passed Vivian's careful inspection, providing warmth as autumn brought cooler temperatures. They scavenged materials from abandoned structures deeper in the forest. An old hunting camp yielded a serviceable mattress for the metal bed frame, while a collapsed shed provided usable lumber for repairs. Each evening, Vivian documented their progress. The journal's pages filled with practical observations, expenses tracked to the penny, and notes about James Thornton gleaned from town visits and discoveries within the cabin itself. The mining journals proved particularly interesting, containing detailed observations about geological formations throughout the region with special attention to silver deposits. One crisp October morning, as Vivian and Nate worked to reinforce the sagging porch, a pickup truck rumbled up their dirt track. Their first visitor since moving to the cabin. A gray-haired woman emerged regarding them with open curiosity. She wore practical clothes, jeans, flannel shirt, sturdy boots, and moved with the confidence of someone comfortable in mountain terrain. "I'm Eleanor Blackwell. My family owned this mountain before the mining company bought it back in the 30s. Heard in town someone was living up here again." Vivian introduced herself, and Nate, conscious of her worn jeans and work-roughened hands. Eleanor's gaze took in the repairs, the neatly stacked firewood, the small garden they'd started with seeds from the hardware store. "You've done more with this place in a month than anyone expected. Most folks thought you'd give up after the first rain." Eleanor became a regular visitor, bringing occasional treats, fresh eggs from her chickens, apples from her orchard, advice about surviving mountain winters. More importantly, she brought stories about James Thornton. James was running from something, though he never said what. Brilliant man, knew more about these mountains' geology than folks who'd lived here all their lives. He was convinced there were untapped silver deposits throughout this region. Spent years mapping and sampling, documenting everything with scientific precision. Why didn't he file mining claims? Vivian asked, thinking of the detailed surveys they'd found. Eleanor shrugged. "Said something once about responsible development and corporate exploitation. I gathered he had ethical concerns about how mining was conducted, wanted to ensure any silver found would benefit local communities rather than distant corporations." These conversations added depth to Vivian's understanding of the mysterious JT, whose presence seemed to linger in the cabin. His bookshelves still held technical volumes on geology and mining. His handcrafted furniture bore marks of careful workmanship. Even the cabin's layout, oriented to capture maximum sunlight, positioned near the creek, but safely above flood level, spoke of thoughtful planning. As October progressed, Vivian's attention turned to winter preparations. Eleanor's warnings about mountain snowfalls added urgency to their work. They gathered and split firewood, insulated the cabin's walls with materials salvaged from the abandoned hunting camp, and constructed a root cellar for preserving food. Their financial situation remained precarious. Vivian's small divorce settlement had nearly run out despite careful rationing. She began taking odd jobs in Pineville, tutoring high school students in science, helping at the hardware store during busy periods, editing technical documents for a small engineering firm. These jobs provided barely enough income for essentials, with nothing left for luxuries or emergencies. On a particularly cold afternoon, as Vivian and Nate worked to reinforce the outhouse before winter storms arrived, Nate lost his footing on frozen ground. Reaching to steady himself, he put weight against a rotted floorboard that gave way, suddenly sending him tumbling halfway through the structure. Vivian rushed to pull him free, checking for injuries with terrified hands. Nate seemed more surprised than hurt, brushing dirt from his clothes as he pointed downward. "Mom, there's something down there. Looks like a metal box." Kneeling beside the hole, Vivian directed the flashlight beam into the space beneath the outhouse. What appeared to be a small footlocker sat nestled against one of the foundation posts, partially concealed by dirt and debris. The structure had been built directly over this hidden container, intentional concealment, not coincidence. With careful maneuvering, they extracted the locker without further damaging the outhouse. The metal was tarnished but intact, secured with a padlock that had succumbed to decades of rust and exposure. A firm twist with pliers broke the corroded mechanism. The lid opened with a reluctant creak. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth bundles carefully sealed against moisture, lay a collection that made Vivian's breath catch. Documents, maps, what appeared to be ore samples, all preserved with meticulous care despite 55 years of hiding. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the first bundle, unwrapping the protective covering to reveal papers that had maintained remarkable preservation. Mining claim certificates prepared but never filed, detailed topographical maps with locations marked using symbols and coordinates, letters written in careful handwriting addressed but never sent. And beneath it all, a leather-bound journal with initials embossed on the cover. J.T. James Thornton. Nate whispered, peering over Vivian's shoulder at their discovery. The implications crystallized slowly. James Thornton hadn't merely been interested in the region's geology. He had discovered something significant enough to document exhaustively, something he had chosen to hide rather than claim publicly. Nate carefully lifted a small leather pouch from the bottom of the locker. Inside were dozens of rock samples, each labeled with coordinates and dates. Several displayed distinctive metallic gleam that Vivian recognized from her chemistry background. Silver ore. Apparently, high-grade specimens based on visible content. They carried their discovery back to the cabin, spreading contents across the handmade table for proper examination. The maps revealed landscape mapped with scientific precision, elevations, water sources, geological formations, all documented with professional skill. Several locations were marked with symbols that, when cross-referenced with Thornton's journal, indicated silver deposits of varying richness. The journal provided narrative context. James Thornton had indeed been a mining engineer from Denver with credentials from the Colorado School of Mines. He had purchased the Blackwell Ridge property specifically for its proximity to geological formations he believed contained untapped silver deposits, and based on the samples and documentation, he had been correct. Vivian turned pages by lantern light as Nate examined maps and samples. Thornton's early entries focused on technical observations or quality vein thickness, extraction challenges. But as the journal progressed, his writing became more philosophical, questioning the ethics of mineral extraction and expressing concerns about environmental impact. June 15, 1967. The silver content in today's samples exceeds anything previously documented in this region. Conservative estimates suggest commercial viability far beyond initial projections. Yet I find myself increasingly concerned about what mining operations would do to this landscape. Standard extraction methods would devastate the watershed for decades. August 3, 1967. Another letter from Western Mining Corporation today. Their offers grow more substantial with each communication. They sense the value of my research but understand nothing of its broader implications. To them, these mountains represent only profit margins and shareholder value. October 17, 1967. Made the decision today to withhold my findings from public record. Instead of filing claims immediately, I will complete the documentation and preserve everything for future consideration. Perhaps in time, extraction technologies will advance to permit responsible development. Until then, the silver remains safer in the ground than in corporate ledgers. The final entries described Thornton's methodical concealment of his research, careful wrapping of documents, construction of hiding places throughout the property, the decision to leave sufficient clues that someone committed to the place might eventually discover what he had found. February 28, 1971. I leave this record for whoever follows, whenever that may be. The silver deposits documented herein are real and substantial. They represent wealth that could transform lives, but only if approached with respect for the land that holds them. May whoever finds these papers understand that true value lies not in extraction alone, but in responsible stewardship. Vivian closed the journal, her mind racing. James Thornton had discovered commercially viable silver deposits throughout the region. He had documented everything necessary for legal claims, then deliberately hidden that information rather than sell it to corporate interests or exploit it himself. And now, through pure chance, a 50-cent auction bid, a rotted floorboard, a stumble that information had come to them. Nate's voice broke through her thoughts, expression caught between excitement and uncertainty. Does this mean we're rich? Vivian looked at the materials spread across the table, the culmination of one man's life work potentially worth millions, if the silver deposits were as substantial as Thornton's documentation suggested. Yet the journal also contained clear warnings about ethical complexities, concerns that resonated with her own environmental awareness. It means we found something important, something James Thornton thought was worth protecting. We need to understand exactly what we've discovered before making any decisions. She opened her own journal, making notes with methodical precision that had become her anchor through uncertainty. Found hidden documents from James Thornton, detailed maps of silver deposits throughout region, mining claim certificates prepared but never filed. Journal expressing ethical concerns about extraction methods. Need to research current mining law, environmental regulations, verification of deposit locations, legal status of potential claims after 55 years. That night, after Nate had fallen asleep, Vivian remained at the table reading more of Thornton's journal by lantern light. His words painted a picture of a man caught between practical opportunity and ethical principle, between personal gain and environmental concern. The parallels to her own situation were impossible to ignore. Financial desperation balanced against long-term consequences, immediate needs against future responsibilities. The hidden documents represented possibility, a way out of their financial precarity, perhaps even prosperity. But they also represented responsibility to the land, to the community, to Thornton's clearly expressed wishes for responsible development. The path forward wasn't as simple as filing claims and cashing in. Vivian fell asleep at the table, Thornton's journal opened beside her own. She dreamed of silver veins running through mountain stone, of water flowing clear over precious metals, of a legacy preserved for 55 years before finding its way into desperate but careful hands. Morning brought clarity and purpose. Vivi spent 2 hours organizing Thornton's documents into categories: geological surveys, mineral samples, correspondence, legal certificates. The meticulous nature of his work became more apparent with each item examined. Every sample was labeled with precise coordinates, dates, and technical observations. Every map cross-referenced multiple data sources. This wasn't amateur prospecting. This was professional geological survey work worth tens of thousands in modern dollars. Nate sat cross-legged on the floor, comparing Thornton's hand-drawn maps to satellite imagery on Vivi's phone during the brief moments when signal flickered through. The coordinates matched geological features visible even from space ridge outcroppings, creek junctions, specific granite formations. He wasn't guessing. Everything checks out. Look, this notation about quartz-bearing schist at the Willow Creek Junction. You can see the rock formation right here on the satellite view. Vivi knelt beside him, tracing the correspondence between 55-year-old observations and contemporary satellite data. Thornton had documented the landscape with such precision that his work remained valid despite the passage of decades. Mountains didn't change on human timescales. The silver he'd found would still be there waiting. They decided to hike to the nearest marked location, Willow Creek, approximately 3 miles northeast according to Thornton's maps. The trail was overgrown but navigable, winding through dense forest before opening into a natural amphitheater of stone. Water had carved through layers of granite and quartz, exposing mineral veins that glinted in afternoon sunlight. Vivi's breath caught. Even with her limited geology knowledge, she could see what had excited Thornton. The rock face displayed clear stratification with darker metallic seams running through lighter stone. She collected small samples, comparing them to photographs in Thornton's journal. The match was unmistakable. This is exactly where he said it would be. Nate moved through the site with growing excitement, his earlier skepticism evaporating. The cairns he built to mark sampling locations are still here. They returned to the cabin as shadows lengthened, carrying samples and new understanding. Thornton's documentation wasn't theoretical speculation. He had mapped actual verifiable deposits. The question wasn't whether the silver existed, but what to do with that knowledge. The black SUV was parked in front of their cabin when they emerged from the forest trail. Vivi's stomach clenched. The vehicle was expensive, out of place on the rutted dirt road. Its tinted windows reflected afternoon light, concealing whoever waited inside. Stay close. Vivi's hand found Nate's shoulder as they approached cautiously. The driver's door opened and a man emerged, charcoal suit, expensive shoes, utterly impractical for mountain terrain. Recognition hit like cold water. The man from the auction. The one who'd laughed at her 50-cent bid. He extended his hand with practiced corporate charm smile, not reaching his eyes. Mrs. Hartwell. I don't believe we were properly introduced at the auction. Richard Blackwell, CEO of Global Resource Enterprises. Vivi didn't take the offered hand, arms crossing protectively. What brings you all the way up our mountain road, Mr. Blackwell? His smile widened, revealing 2 white teeth. Just checking on potential investment opportunities in the area. My company has historical interests in these mountains dating back to my grandfather's time. We're considering reactivating some of those interests, which might impact neighboring properties. His gaze swept over the cabin, taking in their repairs, the newly reinforced porch, the garden plot they'd cleared. Something calculating flickered behind his corporate facade. "You've put considerable work into this place. Admirable, if perhaps misguided. This region has significant mineral potential that a small residential holding can't properly develop." Vivi kept her voice level, though her heart hammered. "We're quite happy with our home as it is. Not every value can be measured in mineral rights or corporate profits." Richard's expression hardened momentarily before the professional smile returned. "Of course. Still, should you ever reconsider your situation, my company would be interested in purchasing your property. We could offer substantially more than your current investment." He produced a business card, expensive paper stock incongruous against Vivi's work-roughened hands. "Something to consider as winter approaches. These mountains can be unforgiving to the unprepared. Accidents happen with unfortunate regularity." The implied threat hung in the air as he returned to his SUV. The engine disturbed the mountain quiet, powerful and out of place. Vivi watched until the vehicle disappeared around the bend, her mind racing through implications. Inside the cabin, Nate helped her retrieve Thornton's documents from their hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. Together they spread the maps across the table, examining them with new urgency. Several of Thornton's marked deposits fell within areas that would have been owned by the original Blackwell Mining Company. If Global Resource Enterprises had acquired those historical interests, they might have legal standing to pursue mineral rights throughout the region, except where valid competing claims existed. Thornton's unfiled documentation represented exactly that possibility. Competing claims based on detailed geological work. Claims that Vivi might now be positioned to file if she could navigate the legal and financial requirements. "He knows." Nate traced one of Thornton's maps with his finger, his voice thoughtful beyond his years. "That's why he came. He knows Thornton had surveys of the area, and he's worried we found them." Vivi opened her journal, making notes with renewed purpose. "Visit from Richard Blackwell, Global Resource Enterprises, clearly interested in mineral rights throughout region. Potential connection to original Blackwell Mining Company." Thornton's documentation now appears strategically significant, not merely historical. Next steps: consult mining law attorney, assess financial requirements for filing claims, determine environmental impact of responsible development. Consider Thornton's ethical framework as guideline for decisions. Eleanor arrived the following morning with eggs and urgent news. She'd heard through Pineville's efficient gossip network that Global Resource had filed preliminary paperwork for large-scale mining operations throughout the Blackwell Ridge area. "They're moving fast." Eleanor set the egg basket on the table, her weathered face concerned. "Word is they've been planning this for years, just waiting for the right regulatory climate. Your little cabin might be sitting right in the middle of their extraction zone." Vivi felt the walls closing in. They'd been at the cabin barely 2 months, had just begun to feel secure, and now corporate machinery was grinding toward them. "I need legal advice. Do you know anyone who understands mining law?" Eleanor's face brightened slightly. "I know exactly who you need. Rebecca Sterling. Environmental attorney, practices out of Helena. She's actually related to Richard's second cousin or something, but chose the opposite path. Family gatherings are tense from what I hear." The drive to Helena consumed most of the next day. Rebecca Sterling's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house, its walls covered with framed environmental awards and newspaper articles about successful legal challenges to corporate mining operations. Rebecca herself was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a direct manner that wasted no words. She listened without interrupting as Vivi explained their situation. The 50-cent auction, the hidden documents, Richard Blackwell's unexpected visit. Then Vivi spread Thornton's materials across Rebecca's desk. The attorney's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine fascination as she examined the maps and surveys. "Thornton's work is extraordinary. This level of geological detail would cost tens of thousands to produce today. What you've found could save you enormous expenses if you decide to pursue mining claims." The technical explanation that followed tested Vivi's understanding. Modern mining claims required precise documentation of mineral deposits, environmental impact studies, filing fees, and ongoing maintenance to remain valid. Thornton's work provided the geological foundation, but they would still need to navigate complex regulatory requirements and substantial costs. Filing fees alone would be around $500 per claim. Rebecca traced one of Thornton's marked sites. Then there are survey verification costs, environmental assessments, legal expenses. We're talking at least $10,000 to establish even a single claim properly. Vivi's stomach sank. She had $25 until her next paycheck. "But there's something else you should consider." Rebecca turned to a different section of Thornton's materials. These maps and assay reports aren't just scientifically valuable, they're historically significant. Thornton was documenting these deposits at exactly the time the original Blackwell Mining Company was collapsing. There might be complicated ownership questions here that could work in your favor. Rebecca's suggestion to start with historical research sent them to county archives housed in the basement of the Helena courthouse. There, amid dusty ledgers and faded property records, the pieces of Thornton's story began assembling into a picture far more complex than Vivi had imagined. Thornton hadn't been a solitary prospector. According to employment records from 1965, he'd been hired by Western Mining Corporation to conduct geological surveys of the Blackwell Ridge area. His credentials were impeccable master's degree from Colorado School of Mines, 5 years experience with major mining operations in Colorado and Nevada. But something had gone wrong. A letter from Western Mining dated October 1966 formally accepted Thornton's resignation, noting irreconcilable differences regarding corporate environmental policies. 6 months later, Western Mining filed a lawsuit against Thornton for fraudulent misrepresentation of survey findings. Court records showed Thornton had won the case decisively, with the judge noting that Western Mining had failed to provide any evidence of fraud. University of Colorado employment records told another part of the story. Thornton had been hired as an assistant professor of geology in January 1967. By December 1968, he'd been dismissed despite positive performance reviews. The official reason cited budgetary constraints, but a notation in the margins referenced pressure from major donors regarding Dr. Thornton's public statements on mining industry practices. The missing person report from March 1971 was brief and disturbing. James Thornton, age 41, had failed to appear for scheduled meetings with his attorney. Friends reported his Denver office had been broken into, files disturbed. Police investigated the Blackwell Ridge cabin, finding it secured but containing no items of value or evidence of foul play. The case remained open but inactive. Most chilling was the signature on the police report. Lead Detective Robert Blackwell. Vivi's hands trembled as she photocopied the document. Blackwell. Rebecca examined the signature. Richard's father. He was sheriff of this county for 30 years, retired in 1995. Died in 2008. The implications were suffocating. The police officer investigating Thornton's disappearance had been part of the family whose mining company wanted Thornton's surveys. The cabin had been searched, but nothing of value found because Thornton had hidden everything before whatever happened to him. We need to be very careful. Rebecca's voice was quiet but urgent. If what I think happened actually happened, we're dealing with people who covered up a murder for 55 years. Back at the cabin that evening, Vivi couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow beyond the windows seemed threatening. Every distant sound could be someone approaching. She'd stumbled into something far larger and darker than a simple property dispute. Nate noticed her tension, his own anxiety evident. Are we safe here? Vivi pulled him close, wishing she felt certain enough to lie. We'll be careful. We'll be smart. And we'll find out the truth about what happened to James Thornton. The next morning, Nate explored the property more systematically than before, looking for additional hiding places Thornton might have created. He'd developed a theory that the observation posts Thornton had built, small structures overlooking approach roads, might contain more than just strategic viewpoints. The third post he checked, carefully camouflaged on a ridge overlooking their access road, yielded results. A waterproof container had been wedged into a crevice between rocks, sealed so well it had survived 55 years of weather. Inside was a video camera, old VHS format, and several sealed tapes. Vivi's hands shook as she connected the camera to their small generator. The screen flickered to life, grainy but functional. She inserted the first tape, barely breathing. James Thornton appeared on screen, sitting in what was recognizably their cabin's main room, though decades younger and better maintained. He looked directly at the camera, his expression grave. If you're watching this, I'm likely dead. The words hit like physical blows. Vivi sank onto the floor beside Nate, both of them transfixed. My name is James Thornton, geologist. I came to Blackwell Ridge in 1965 to survey mineral deposits for Western Mining Corporation. What I found changed everything. He described the silver deposit's 5 major sites, high-grade ore, commercially viable. But extraction would poison the water supply for 3 towns downstream. When he'd refused to give Western Mining his data, they'd offered millions. He still refused. So they'd gotten creative, accused him of fraud, destroyed his reputation, got him fired from the university. But I kept my surveys, and now they want them badly enough to threaten my life. The camera quality was poor, lighting inadequate, but Thornton's intelligence and integrity came through clearly. He explained his decision to hide everything: maps, certificates, samples, documentation. I'm hiding everything here. Maps, certificates, samples, everything needed to file legal claims. Not for profit, but for protection. Whoever finds this, you have a choice. Sell to corporations and make millions while destroying the watershed. Or file community-based claims that protect the land while benefiting local people. His voice carried conviction despite obvious fear. I chose protection. It cost me everything, career, reputation, probably my life. But some things matter more than personal gain. In this cabin are instructions for filing claims, environmental impact studies I conducted, and evidence of Western Mining's threats. Use them wisely. He leaned closer to the camera, eyes intense. The treasure isn't silver. It's the choice to do right when wrong would be easier and more profitable. A sound came from off-camera footsteps, maybe voices. Thornton's expression shifted to alarm. He reached toward the camera, the screen went dark. The tape ended. Vivi and Nate sat in stunned silence. They'd just watched the final recorded moments of a man who'd been murdered for refusing to compromise his principles. A man who'd hidden his life's work not for personal gain, but as a legacy for someone who might use it responsibly. He knew. Nate's voice was barely a whisper. He knew they were coming for him, and he still wouldn't give in. Vivi rewound the tape, watching Thornton's face again. Something about his eyes, the set of his jaw, reminded her of Nate. That same stubborn integrity that refused to bend even under impossible pressure. We have to finish what he started. The words emerged from somewhere deep, a commitment forming before conscious decision. James Thornton died protecting this land. We can't let that be for nothing. They returned to Helena the following week, with Rebecca this time targeting specific records. Corporate filings showed Western Mining Corporation had merged with Blackwell Mining Company in 1975, 4 years after Thornton's disappearance. The combined entity had struggled through the 80s before being acquired by Global Resource Enterprises in 1998. Richard Blackwell. The man who'd visited their cabin was listed as CEO since 2005. His father, Robert Blackwell, had served on Western Mining's board of directors from 1968 until his death. The connections were damning. The family that had wanted Thornton's surveys had spent 55 years trying to acquire them through whatever means necessary. Murder, if Vivi's suspicions were correct. Certainly corruption, given Robert Blackwell's dual role as sheriff and corporate board member. Rebecca helped them search for additional evidence. Property deeds revealed that much of the land Thornton had surveyed had remained in some form of Blackwell family control, passed through shell companies and trusts, but ultimately traceable back to the original mining operations. But here's what's interesting. Rebecca spread out a series of property maps. Thornton's cabin sits on one of the few parcels that was sold off before Western Mining went under. It was deemed worthless. No road access, no utilities, too remote for development, which is probably why they didn't bother maintaining control of it, and why they searched it in 1971 but didn't think to dig up the outhouse floor. Vivi felt pieces clicking into place. They assumed if Thornton hid anything, it would be in Denver or a safety deposit box, somewhere civilized, not buried under a mountain outhouse. In Thornton's hidden container beneath the journal and maps, Vivi found 3 letters. Each was carefully written, addressed, but never sent. The first was to a Denver attorney, dated January 1971, detailing specific threats Thornton had received from Western Mining executives. Names, dates, exact wording of warnings. It read like evidence prepared for a criminal trial. The second was addressed to the Environmental Protection Agency, dated February 1971. It outlined Western Mining's practice of concealing negative environmental impact reports, providing specific examples with documentation. The third letter was addressed to Thornton himself, dated February 20, 1971, just over a week before he disappeared. If I die unexpectedly, investigate Western Mining. They've threatened me repeatedly. I have copies of all evidence in 3 locations. My Denver office likely compromised a safety deposit box in Colorado Springs Key with my lawyer in this cabin. I don't want revenge. I want protection for this land. File the claims I've prepared. Stop them from poisoning the watershed. The cabin is yours if you find this. Small payment for finishing what I started. Vivi read the letter 3 times, each reading hitting harder. Thornton had known death was coming, had prepared for it, had left his cabin, his sanctuary, as payment to whoever would continue his work. This wasn't luck. Her voice cracked slightly. This wasn't random chance that we bought this cabin. This was James Thornton reaching across 55 years, waiting for someone who would understand. Nate read over her shoulder, his young face serious. He trusted that the right person would find it eventually. Someone who needed shelter badly enough to buy a worthless cabin, but had enough integrity to use his work the right way. That night, Vivi made her decision. She opened her journal, writing with steady purpose despite exhaustion and fear. James Thornton died for these principles. I will not betray him by selling out to the people who murdered him. Tomorrow I begin the process of filing a claim on Willow Creek. I'll use every dollar I have left. I'll take every risk necessary. Because some things matter more than safety or comfort. Sometimes doing right means betting everything on a dead man's dream. Eleanor helped arrange a meeting at the Grange Hall Pineville's community center. Word had spread about Global Resources mining permits, and concern was building among locals who remembered how mining companies had devastated other watersheds in the past. The turnout surprised Vivi. Over 100 people crammed into a space meant for 60. Ranchers, teachers, small business owners, retirees. People whose lives depended on clean water and intact ecosystems. Jake Morrison, a weathered rancher in his 60s, stood to address the crowd. My family's worked this land for 3 generations. We've watched companies like Global Resource extract wealth and leave environmental damage for locals to live with. Vivian Hartwell isn't just fighting for her claim. She's fighting for all of us who want responsible development instead of corporate exploitation. He pulled out his checkbook. I'm pledging $5,000 toward her legal defense fund. Who's with me? Hands rose across the room. Pledges came in, amounts large and small. $100 from a retired teacher, $2,000 from the owner of the hardware store, $500 from a young couple expecting their first child. By evening's end, over $38,000 had been committed. Vivi stood before the gathered community, emotion tightening her throat. When I bought that cabin for 50 cents, I was just looking for shelter. I never imagined finding myself in this fight. But James Thornton left his documentation for a reason. He believed the mineral wealth of these mountains should benefit local communities, not distant corporations. With your help, we can honor his vision. An accountant volunteered to manage the legal defense fund. Environmental consultants offered to assess sites and develop responsible mining plans. Political connections mobilized to ensure county commissioners understood the broad community support. Security volunteers organized to counter corporate surveillance. What began as Vivi's isolated struggle had evolved into community action. The Sullivan Resource Cooperative was formally established that night, named for the values Thornton had died defending. But Global Resource Enterprises responded to community mobilization with increased pressure. Surveillance teams became more numerous and obvious. Administrative challenges multiplied, sudden inspections, permit questions, zoning concerns that had never existed before. Most alarmingly, Vivi received notice that David, her ex-husband, had filed for emergency reconsideration of their custody arrangement. The petition cited reckless endangerment through inadequate living conditions. The timing and language mirrored Global's corporate strategy so precisely that Rebecca had no doubt who'd orchestrated and financed the legal action. They're attacking on all fronts now, Rebecca explained during a strategy session at Eleanor's home where secure communication was possible. The custody challenge is particularly concerning. Family courts operate independently from mining claim proceedings. Even if we're winning on mineral rights, you could still face separation from Nate. The threat struck at Vivi's deepest vulnerability. Her scientific mind had approached the mining claim as a complex problem to solve, but the prospect of losing Nate transformed the conflict from abstract legal principles to visceral primal fear. Eleanor's weathered face set in determined lines. They've miscalculated. They think threatening your family will make you back down. Instead, they've just made this personal for everyone supporting you. In mountain communities, we don't take kindly to outsiders threatening one of our own, especially not a child. The community response proved Eleanor right. When David arrived for preliminary custody hearings, he found himself isolated in a hostile environment. The local hotel mysteriously had no vacancies despite empty parking lots. Restaurants experienced kitchen problems that delayed service indefinitely. His rental car company discovered mechanical issues requiring immediate attention. These weren't coordinated actions. No one had organized a formal boycott. Rather, it was the natural response of a community that valued relationships over corporate influence. David found himself unable to function in a place where everyone knew why he'd really come. The custody hearing itself revealed how thoroughly Global had overplayed their hand. Vivi presented comprehensive documentation of Nate's educational progress, physical health, emotional well-being. Community members testified to his evident happiness. Most decisively, the social services representative who'd conducted the welfare check testified that while living conditions were unconventional, they showed no signs of neglect or endangerment. The family court judge, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and little patience for manipulation, was unimpressed by David's sudden concern after months of minimal contact. Who provided the legal resources for this emergency petition? What specific evidence of endangerment prompted this sudden action? Why are you represented by a corporate law firm specializing in natural resource litigation rather than family law? The petition was dismissed with prejudice. Any future filings would require substantial changes in circumstances and evidence of actual rather than hypothetical concerns. This decisive defeat of one aspect of Global's pressure campaign energized the cooperative and strengthened Vivi's resolve. The corporation had revealed its willingness to attack family bonds, confirming every ethical concern Thornton had expressed in his journals. With the custody threat neutralized, Vivi and Rebecca refocused on the mining claim itself. Global's formal challenge required detailed response connecting Thornton's historical documentation to current legal standards. The cooperative's resources made possible expert witnesses and technical analyses that would have otherwise been beyond reach. The completed application represented Vivi's total financial resources and countless hours of work, a desperate gamble that Thornton's meticulous documentation would provide legal standing against corporate opposition. She delivered the package to the county recorder's office personally, watching as each page received an official stamp transforming Thornton's hidden legacy into public record. Mining Claim Number 24136 filed in the name of Vivian Hartwell. The clerk announced applying the final seal. The 30-day public notice period begins immediately. 30 days for Global Resource Enterprises to marshal their legal resources. 30 days for corporate attorneys to find weaknesses in the application challenge standing or pressure officials to reject the claim on technical grounds. The response came faster than expected. That same afternoon, Vivi received a call from Richard Blackwell himself. His tone was professionally cordial but underlaid with steel. I understand you've filed a mining claim based on some old papers you found in that cabin. I'd like to suggest a meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution before this situation becomes unnecessarily complicated. The implied threat was clear. Blackwell proposed a buyout $50,000 for the cabin and all rights to Thornton's documentation. A fortune compared to their current resources, but a pittance measured against the potential value of the silver deposits Thornton had mapped. While I appreciate your interest in resolving this situation, Vivi kept her voice steady despite adrenaline flooding her system. We're not interested in selling Thornton's work. His documentation supports our claim, and we intend to pursue it through proper legal channels. The cordial facade cracked slightly. Mrs. Hartwell, you should understand that mining law is extraordinarily complex. Global Resource has certain historical rights in this region that predate your discovery. Fighting this will cost far more than you can afford, with no guarantee of success. When Vivi maintained her refusal, Blackwell's tone chilled further. I hope you understand what you're risking. Mountain winters are harsh, especially for families in precarious financial situations. Child welfare authorities take a dim view of homes without modern utilities when school-aged children are involved. The threat to custody arrangements sent ice through Vivi's veins. Corporate pressure was extending beyond legal maneuvers to personal intimidation. They weren't just challenging her claim, they were threatening her family. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and forceful. Document everything. Record any further calls. This crosses ethical lines and we can use it against them if they persist. But the intimidation campaign was just beginning. Over the following days, private investigators began contacting people from Vivi's past, former colleagues, Nate's previous school, even distant relatives. The questions focused on her fitness as a parent, suggesting preparations for a custody challenge that would strike at her most vulnerable point. Yet each new pressure tactic seemed to backfire. Teachers from Nate's old school sent letters supporting Vivi's educational approach. Former colleagues praised her integrity and dedication. Even David's own family members quietly reached out to express disgust at his participation in the corporate harassment. The community coalition had transformed into something larger than simple opposition to mining. It had become a referendum on whether ordinary people could stand against corporate power, whether principles mattered more than profit, whether one person's sacrifice 55 years ago could still inspire protection of shared resources. As the 30-day notice period progressed, both sides prepared for the court hearing that would determine mining claim 224-136's validity. Global marshaled an impressive legal team, 6 attorneys specializing in different aspects of mining law, corporate succession, and property rights. Their strategy relied on overwhelming the opposition with procedural complexity. But the cooperative had something Global couldn't purchase: legitimacy rooted in community values and historical truth. Thornton's video testimony would speak directly to those values, explaining precisely why he'd chosen to protect rather than exploit the land. Late one evening, as Vivi reviewed documents by lantern light, Nate looked up from his homework. "Do you think Mr. Thornton would be proud of us?" Vivi considered the question carefully, thinking of the man she'd never met but had come to know through his journals, his careful documentation, his final desperate video recording. I think James Thornton would be grateful. He died alone, believing his work might never be found or understood. Now, 55 years later, a community has formed around his principles. That's more than he could have hoped for. She returned to Thornton's journal, reading an entry from early 1971 that felt particularly relevant. I know the risks I'm taking. I know they may kill me for this. But if I surrender my principles out of fear, I'm already dead in the only way that matters. Better to stand for something and fall than to kneel for safety and live ashamed. Those words had been written by a man who knew death was approaching but refused to compromise. A man who'd chosen integrity over survival, principle over profit, community welfare over personal gain. Vivi closed the journal, her decision crystallizing into certainty. Whatever came next, legal battles, corporate pressure, financial hardship, she would honor Thornton's choice. Some things were worth fighting for even against impossible odds. Outside, mountain darkness pressed against the cabin windows, but inside, lantern light illuminated maps and documents that represented one man's life work and one woman's determination to see it fulfilled. 55 years had passed, but the fight James Thornton began was finally truly joined. The courtroom in Helena filled early on the morning of the hearing. Local residents occupied every available seat, their presence a silent statement of support that no amount of corporate money could manufacture. Vivi sat at the plaintiff's table beside Rebecca, watching Global Resources' legal team arrange their materials with the precision of a military operation. 6 attorneys in matching Navy suits, each handling a different aspect of the challenge: mining law, corporate succession, environmental regulation, property rights, historical precedent, procedural technicalities. Their strategy was transparent: bury the opposition under an avalanche of legal complexity until resistance became financially and mentally unsustainable. Judge Margaret Stone entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She was 65, with steel-gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen every courtroom trick attempted over 4 decades on the bench. Her reputation for impatience with corporate intimidation tactics had been one reason Rebecca felt optimistic despite the odds. The judge surveyed the packed courtroom, her expression unreadable. This is Mining Claim 224136, Hartwell versus Global Resource Enterprises. Before we begin, I want to make clear that this court will not tolerate theatrics, intimidation, or procedural gamesmanship from either side. We're here to determine facts and apply law, nothing more. Lead counsel for Global Resource stood a man named Marcus Williams, whose billable rate probably exceeded Vivi's annual salary. He began with the confident authority of someone accustomed to winning. Your Honor, this case is straightforward despite plaintiffs' attempts to complicate it through emotional appeals. Global Resource Enterprises holds legitimate historical rights to mineral extraction throughout the Blackwell Ridge area, rights that predate any claims based on documents of questionable provenance found in an abandoned structure. He detailed Global's corporate lineage, the merger of Western Mining and Blackwell Mining in 1975, subsequent acquisitions, continuous maintenance of mineral rights through proper legal channels for over 50 years. His argument was technically proficient, designed to make Vivi's claim appear opportunistic and legally baseless. Rebecca stood when Williams finished, her voice carrying none of his corporate polish but substantially more conviction. Your Honor, we have video testimony from James Thornton himself recorded in February 1971, 1 week before his disappearance. This testimony establishes his credentials, validates his geological documentation, and provides clear evidence of his intentions regarding these mineral deposits. The large screen at the front of the courtroom came to life. James Thornton appeared sitting in the cabin that Vivi now called home, speaking directly across 55 years. If you're watching this, I'm likely dead. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even Global's attorneys stopped their whispering consultations. Thornton's voice filled the space, carrying authority that transcended the grainy video quality. He explained his survey work, his credentials from Colorado School of Mines, the verification of his findings by 3 independent laboratories. He detailed the silver deposits, their quality, extent, commercial viability. Then he shifted to why he'd hidden rather than filed his claims. Standard extraction methods would devastate the watershed for decades. I refused to give Western Mining my data. They offered millions. I still refused. So they destroyed my career, my reputation, and now they're threatening my life. Thornton leaned closer to the camera, his eyes intense with purpose. I'm preserving this information for whoever finds it, not for profit, but for protection. These deposits should be developed by people who understand that the land itself is more valuable than anything you can extract from it. The sound from off-camera footsteps, voices, and Thornton's sudden alarm, his hand reaching toward the lens, the screen going dark. No one moved for several seconds after the video ended. The silence held weight as though Thornton's presence had physically entered the courtroom. Judge Stone's voice was carefully controlled. "Mr. Williams, your client claims superior rights based on partnership agreements with Richard Sullivan. Please explain how those agreements remain valid after Mr. Sullivan's death in 1970 and the subsequent dissolution of the Family Mining Consortium." Williams recovered his composure, launching into explanations about corporate succession agreements and documented transfer of rights. But something had shifted. The judge's questions grew sharper, more skeptical. She focused on gaps in Global's documentation, on the convenient timing of certain acquisitions, on the curious absence of actual filed claims, despite decades of supposed control. Rebecca presented Thornton's letters next, the ones detailing threats from Western mining executives, the evidence of concealed environmental reports, the final letter written to himself acknowledging that death was likely imminent. "These letters were never sent, Your Honor, because James Thornton was murdered before he could mail them." The police investigation was led by Robert Blackwell, whose family owned the mining company that wanted Thornton's surveys. The investigation concluded nothing of value was found at the cabin because they either didn't search thoroughly or deliberately concealed what they found. Williams objected strenuously, claiming speculation without evidence. But Judge Stone overruled him, noting that the documented timeline and relationships raised legitimate questions about the 1971 investigation's integrity. Rebecca called her first expert witness, a retired geology professor from Montana State who'd reviewed Thornton's surveys and samples. Dr. Thornton's work meets or exceeds modern professional standards. His methodologies were sound, his documentation meticulous, his conclusions well supported by physical evidence. These surveys would be admissible as expert testimony in any mining claim proceeding today. Global's attorneys cross-examined aggressively, but the expert stood firm. Thornton's work was legitimate, valuable, and scientifically valid. The second expert was an environmental engineer who'd analyzed Thornton's concerns about watershed contamination. Dr. Thornton's predictions about environmental impact were remarkably accurate. Modern extraction in this region has produced exactly the kind of groundwater contamination he warned about in 1967. His environmental impact assessments demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydrology and long-term ecosystem effects. When Rebecca rested her case, Judge Stone called a brief recess. Vivi stepped outside into crisp November air, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. Eleanor appeared with coffee, her weathered face cautiously optimistic. "You're doing well in there. The judge is listening, really listening. That video of James, you could have heard a pin drop." Nate emerged from the courtroom where he'd been sitting with Jake Morrison, his young face serious. The lawyers for Global keep looking at each other like they didn't expect this, like they thought it would be easy. When court resumed, Judge Stone addressed the assembly with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the broader implications of her ruling. This court finds that James Thornton's documentation provides legitimate foundation for new mining claims. His video testimony establishes clear intention for community-based development that protects environmental resources. His professional credentials and methodological rigor are not in dispute. She paused, letting the weight settle. Global Resource Enterprises has failed to prove superior rights to the disputed mineral deposits. The evidence suggests that Western Mining Corporation, Global's corporate predecessor, engaged in threats and intimidation against Dr. Thornton. The 1971 police investigation, led by an officer with direct family ties to the mining company, raises serious questions about potential cover-up of criminal activity. Williams stood quickly, attempting to interrupt, but Judge Stone continued without acknowledging him. Furthermore, Dr. Thornton's decision to withhold his surveys from public record does not constitute abandonment. Rather, it represents a deliberate choice to preserve information until such time as it could be used responsibly. Mining claim 224136 is hereby approved and recorded in the name of Vivian Hartwell. The courtroom erupted in cheers from community supporters. Global's legal team immediately huddled, already planning appeals. But Judge Stone's ruling had established legal precedent that would be difficult to overturn. Community claims based on legitimate geological work would receive equal consideration with corporate development proposals. "We won." Nate's whisper barely penetrated the noise around them. Vivi pulled him close, aware that their victory extended far beyond personal gain. "James Thornton won. We just finished what he started 55 years ago." As they left the courthouse, surrounded by celebrating supporters, Vivi looked back at Global's legal team packing their expensive briefcases with tight efficiency. The corporate machine had encountered something its resources couldn't simply overwhelm: a community united around principles that valued long-term relationships over short-term profit. but the celebration was premature. 3 days after the ruling, Rebecca called with concerning news. Global filed their appeal this morning. They're also pursuing a different angle, challenging whether Thornton's coordinates are actually accurate. They're demanding independent verification of the deposits before allowing any development. The verification would cost thousands more. Money the cooperative had but would stretch their resources dangerously thin. Yet without confirmation, Global could claim Thornton's documentation was theoretical rather than factual. Vivi agreed to the verification, knowing they had no choice. 2 weeks later, an independent geological team arrived to survey the Willow Creek site using Thornton's coordinates. The process took 4 days of drilling, sampling, and analysis. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. The silver deposits were not only exactly where Thornton had mapped them, they were richer than his conservative estimates had suggested. Modern assay technology revealed ore quality that would have been impossible to verify in 1967. But during the verification process, Nate made a discovery that transformed their understanding of Thornton's legacy entirely. He'd been organizing materials for his college preparatory program, comparing Thornton's maps to modern geological surveys. Something didn't align properly. Coordinates that should have matched specific features were off by small but consistent margins. "Mom, look at this." Nate spread maps across the table, his excitement building. "Thornton's coordinates are wrong. Not by much, but consistently, like he shifted them on purpose." Vivi examined the discrepancies, her scientific training engaged. Why would he deliberately misrecord his own data? That's what I wondered. But then I noticed if you adjust each coordinate by the same offset and plot them on a map centered on the cabin, they point to specific landmarks, things you can see from different windows. He demonstrated, showing how the adjusted coordinates aligned perfectly with distinctive rock formations, dead trees, creek junctions, all visible from strategic viewpoints around the cabin. It's a verification system. You'd only recognize the pattern if you'd actually lived here long enough to know the landscape intimately. Someone just reading the maps would go to the wrong locations and conclude the deposits didn't exist. Vivi's breath caught as implications crystallized. Thornton had created a failsafe to prevent his work from being used by corporate interests who might steal his documents but wouldn't invest time actually living on the land. The true locations were encoded in a pattern that required intimate knowledge of the property. How many adjusted coordinates are there? Nate traced through the maps systematically. At least 3 major sites that aren't marked on the primary maps at all on land that's currently uncontrolled by either U.S. or Global. They filed claims on the newly identified deposits within 48 hours, using the cooperative's established legal framework. Each new claim strengthened the community model, expanding sustainable operations while preserving environmental principles. Global Resources attorneys immediately challenged the new filings, demanding to know how additional sites had suddenly been identified. Rebecca's response was elegantly simple, careful study of Thornton's complete documentation system, which required extended time at the actual property. The message was clear. Corporate raiders who wanted to steal surveys without understanding the land would always fail Thornton's test. By early spring, the Thornton Resource Cooperative, renamed to honor the man whose principles they embodied, had established controlling interests in most viable silver deposits throughout Blackwell Ridge. Global maintained large-scale operations on previously permitted properties, but found themselves unable to expand beyond initial holdings. 2 very different approaches to resource management now operated in parallel, creating a natural experiment in contrasting philosophies. Global's sites featured standard industrial mining, large equipment, substantial surface disruption, visible impact on surrounding landscape. The cooperative's operations maintained Thornton's lighter touch, targeted extraction, minimal surface disturbance, continuous environmental monitoring. Most telling were water quality measurements downstream from both operations. Despite Global's technical compliance with regulatory requirements, their sites showed expected patterns of incremental degradation, not enough to trigger violations but sufficient to demonstrate cumulative impact. The cooperative sites achieved something remarkable. They actually improved downstream water conditions. The filtration systems designed from Thornton's notes removed historical contaminants while preventing new pollution. Environmental researchers from 3 universities established monitoring projects comparing the 2 models. Economic analysts studied distribution of benefits, corporate operations generating concentrated profits for distant shareholders versus cooperative approaches, circulating gains throughout local communities. Government agencies examined regulatory frameworks that enabled or constrained different development models. Vivi found herself increasingly in demand as speaker and consultant, explaining the cooperative's approach to audiences ranging from environmental conferences to legislative committees. The chemistry teacher who'd once spent 50 cents in desperate search of shelter now advised policymakers on sustainable resource management frameworks. Nate thrived in this environment. His application to Colorado School of Mines, Thornton's alma mater, had been accepted for early admission despite being 4 years younger than typical applicants. Faculty recognized in his application something beyond academic credentials, first-hand knowledge of geological survey methods that had been refined through practical application. The cabin itself had transformed from desperate shelter to comfortable home. The roof was solid, sealed against weather. New windows gleamed in reinforced frames. A modest solar array powered essential appliances and communication equipment. Yet the fundamental character remained handcrafted furniture, stone fireplace, the careful orientation Thornton had chosen to maximize natural light. On a warm evening in late March, exactly 1 year after the auction that had changed everything, Vivi sat at Thornton's handmade table with a blank journal open before her. Nate had already gone to bed exhausted from preparing for his summer program. Outside, spring peepers sang in the creek bottom, their chorus marking the return of life after winter's dormancy. She began to write not in her usual practical notation style, but as a letter to a man she'd never met, but had come to know through his words, his work, his sacrifice. Dear James, we did it. 55 years after you disappeared, justice finally came. I found your cabin with my last 50 cents. Found your journals, your videos, your warnings, found the truth about how they killed you for refusing to sell your soul. But I also found your courage, your belief that one person with principles can make a difference, your faith that someday someone would finish what you started. Nate is going to Colorado, your school. He'll study geology like you. But more importantly, he'll carry your lesson that true treasure isn't silver but integrity. The cabin isn't abandoned anymore. It's alive with your legacy. Every day I sit at the table you built, look through windows you installed, walk on floors you laid, and feel your presence. You were a stranger. I never met you. But you gave us everything: shelter when we had none, purpose when we'd lost direction, proof that doing right matters, even when it costs everything. Vivi paused, considering her next words carefully. The lantern light cast warm shadows across the cabin's interior, illuminating details Thornton had crafted with his own hands decades before she was born. Thank you for the 50-cent miracle. Thank you for waiting 55 years for someone worthy of your trust. Thank you for being brave enough to die, rather than compromise what you believed. Your work is finished. Your land is protected. Your killer's family was defeated. Rest now knowing that your sacrifice wasn't in vain. With deepest gratitude, Vivian Hartwell. She closed the journal, placing it beside Thornton's own on the shelf. 2 records of the same struggle, separated by half a century, but united by common purpose. Nate appeared in the doorway, sleepy but unable to fully settle. Mom, do you think Mr. Thornton knew that someone would actually find everything and understand what he wanted? Vivi considered the question, thinking of Thornton's meticulous planning, the hidden containers, the encoded coordinates, the video testimony prepared in his final days. I think James Thornton hoped. He couldn't know for certain, but he prepared as thoroughly as possible, and then had faith that eventually the right person would come along. Someone desperate enough to buy a worthless cabin, but principled enough to use his work responsibly. And you were that person. Vivi smiled, pulling Nate close. We were, both of us. And now we have to make sure the next generation understands what's been entrusted to them. The following weekend, the cooperative organized a dedication ceremony at the overlook where Thornton had once stood watching his beloved mountains. Over 200 people gathered, community members who'd supported the fight, students learning about sustainable development, reporters documenting the cooperative model's success, and officials from environmental agencies studying replicable frameworks. A memorial stone had been carved from local granite, its surface polished smooth, except for the engraved text. James Thornton, 1930 to 1971. Geologist, protector, guardian. He chose principle over profit, and paid with his life. His legacy lives on. Eleanor stood beside Vivi as the memorial was unveiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. James would be proud, not just of what you accomplished, but how you did it, with integrity, with community, with respect for what he valued. Rebecca had brought documents showing how the Thornton model was being adapted in 4 other states where communities faced similar conflicts between extractive industries and environmental concerns. What had begun as one woman's desperate gamble on a 50-cent cabin had evolved into a movement. Jake Morrison addressed the gathering, his rancher's voice carrying across the assembled crowd. 55 years ago, a man stood alone against corporate greed and paid with his life. Today we stand together proving he was right, that there is another way. That people who love the land can develop its resources without destroying what makes it valuable. James Thornton planted a seed that took half a century to sprout. Now it's our job to make sure it grows. As the ceremony concluded, Vivi and Nate walked to the memorial stone, touching the carved letters that spelled out Thornton's name. The stone would weather here, becoming part of the landscape Thornton had died protecting. Future generations would pass it, learning his story, understanding that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary pressure when principle mattered more than safety. Nate's voice was quiet, reflective. When I'm at Colorado studying the same subjects he studied, I'm going to remember why it matters. Not just the science of finding resources, but the wisdom of using them right. That evening back at the cabin, Vivi stood on the reinforced porch watching sunset paint the valley in shades of amber and rose. The cooperative's operations were visible as small structures integrated carefully into the landscape. Global's industrial sites sat contained within permitted boundaries, their expansion blocked by the network of community claims that surrounded them. The corporate approach and community alternative coexisted now, neither defeating the other, but offering stark contrast in methods and outcomes. Time would tell which model proved more sustainable, but the early evidence favored Thornton's vision. Inside, Vivi prepared one final journal entry for the day. 1 year since the auction. 1 year since 50 cents bought everything that matters. The cabin stands strong. Nate thrives. The cooperative grows. James Thornton's dream lives. I've learned that treasure takes many forms. Sometimes it's silver in the ground. Sometimes it's the courage to protect rather than exploit. Sometimes it's a dead man's faith that the right person will eventually come along. We were supposed to be homeless, hopeless, finished. Instead, we found home, purpose, and a legacy worth preserving. Sometimes the bravest thing is betting everything on nothing. And sometimes 55 years later, that nothing becomes everything. She closed the journal, extinguished the lantern, and sat in darkness broken only by moonlight through the windows Thornton had installed. The cabin held its silence comfortably now, no longer the abandoned relic she'd first entered, but a living memorial to principles that transcended individual lives. In the bedroom, Thornton's carved initials still marked the windowsill. J.T. 1967. No longer a mystery, but a signature one man's claim to have lived here, worked here, stood for something here. Vivi had added her own mark beside his. VH 2026. A continuation of purpose across generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Global's appeals would continue through the courts. The cooperative would face decisions about expansion, sustainability, balancing economic needs with environmental protection. Nate would leave for his summer program, beginning his own journey into the field Thornton had mastered. But tonight, Vivi allowed herself to simply exist in the space Thornton had created, to appreciate the craftsmanship of his furniture, the beauty of his stone fireplace, the wisdom of his careful planning. To understand that she and Nate were not owners of this place so much as temporary stewards holding it in trust for whatever future Thornton's legacy might shape. Outside the mountains stood eternal under starlight. Water flowed clear in the creek, carrying none of the poisons Thornton had warned against. Wind moved through pine branches with the same sound he would have heard during his final nights alive. Somewhere in those mountains, Thornton's body likely remained taken by wilderness when corporate threats became lethal action. He'd died alone, unknown, believing his work might never be found or understood, but he'd been wrong about that final isolation. 55 years late, a community had formed around his principles. His name was spoken with respect. His work guided sustainable development. His sacrifice had not been wasted. Vivi stood moving to the window that faced the overlook where the memorial stone now stood. She couldn't see it in the darkness, but knowing it was there brought comfort. "Rest easy, James. Your watch is over. We've got it from here." The words were whispered to empty air, but somehow the cabin seemed to hold them, as though Thornton's spirit had been waiting 55 years to hear someone acknowledge his sacrifice and promise to continue his work. Morning would come with its demands and challenges, but tonight, in a cabin bought for 50 cents and transformed into a fortress of principle, Vivian Hartwell and her son slept secure in the knowledge that sometimes miracles do start with crazy, and sometimes the dead speak wisdom that the living desperately need to hear. The treasure Thornton had promised was never silver. It was the choice to do right when wrong offered easier paths, the courage to stand alone when everyone else had been bought, the faith that truth and principle would eventually prevail even if victory came decades after death. That treasure Vivi had claimed. And in claiming it, she'd transformed a 50-cent gamble into a legacy that would echo through generations yet unborn, proving that what one person protects today might save communities tomorrow, and that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't wealth, but the courage to do what's right regardless of cost.